Verse 16, then the men set out from there, and they looked toward Sodom, and Abraham went with them to set them on their way. The Lord said, shall I hide from Abraham what I'm about to do? Seeing that Abraham shall become a great and mighty nation, and all the nations of the earth shall be blessed in him. No, for I've chosen him, that he may charge his children and his household after him to keep the way of the Lord by doing righteousness and justice, so that the Lord may bring about for Abraham what he has promised him. Then the Lord said, how great is the outcry against Sodom and Gomorrah, and how very grave their sin. I must go down and see whether they've done altogether according to the outcry that has come to me. And if not, I will know. So the men turned from there and went toward Sodom, while Abraham remained standing before the Lord. Then Abraham came near and said, will you indeed sweep away the righteous with the wicked? Suppose there are 50 righteous within the city. Will you then sweep away the place and not forgive it for 50 righteous who are in it? Sorry, I went too far. Far be it from you to do such a thing, to slay the righteous with the wicked, so that the righteous fare as the wicked. Far be that from you. Shall not the judge of all the earth do what is just? And the Lord said, if I find at Sodom 50 righteous in the city, I will forgive the whole place for their sake. Abraham answered, let me take it upon myself to speak to the Lord. Notice that's not the divine name. That's Adonai again. I who am but dust and ashes. Suppose 5 of the 50 righteous are lacking. Will you destroy the whole city for lack of 5? And he said, I will not destroy it if I find 45 there. And he spoke to him. Again he spoke to him. Suppose 40 are found there. He answered, for the sake of 40, I will not do it. Then he said, oh, do not let the Lord be angry if I speak. Suppose 30 are found there. He answered, I will not do it if I find 30 there. He said, let me take it upon myself to speak to the Lord. Suppose 20 are found there. He answered, for the sake of 20, I will not destroy it. Then he said, oh, do not let the Lord be angry if I speak just once more. Suppose 10 are found there. He answered, for the sake of 10, I will not destroy it. And the Lord went his way when he had finished speaking to Abraham. And Abraham returned to his place. The 2 angels came to Sodom in the evening. I just wanted to stop there because it finally indicates angels. And so the Lord gives us, there's no way Abraham could have known this. This is internal dialogue from the Lord that's revealed to the prophets who wrote Genesis. The Lord has an internal conversation. Should I just go down and destroy Sodom, or should I tell Abraham? And of course, he's here in Hebrews, so he's already decided to tell Abraham. But we're given some of God's thought process here, revealed to us, so we would know why he decided to tell Abraham what he was about to do. And it really has to do with his covenant. Abraham is being uniquely chosen, and he is here to be a blessing to all nations. And one of the ways that God wants Abraham to keep that covenant is by doing righteousness and justice on the earth. So inviting Abraham into a conversation about what it means to do justice is important for God. So God has decided to share this information with Abraham, not as gossip, but as a lesson. And it's a lesson Abraham must learn. And so we want to pay attention to how Abraham interacts and how God responds to help us identify what it means to be a godly person. And I think that's here in the text. So let's get into that.
Yeah, well, even before that, you see a little bit of more of an explanation of Abraham's role as the father of nations too. I mean, verse 19 really sticks out to me too.
Yep.
I don't know if that's not something we want to talk about so much.
Yeah, that's what I was actually quoting when it said that he's to keep the way of the Lord by doing righteousness and justice. That's from verse 19.
Right, but it's teaching that to his children.
Yep.
So that he will direct his children and his household after him to keep that way.
That's right.
Showing that that's part of what that blessing is, or that continuation. I think it really
absolutely does. And it's modeled here because God is going to have the kind of mentoring of Abraham that he's going to expect Abraham to have of his children.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
So this conversation that God and Abraham have is a model for what a godly parent, the kind of conversation a godly parent has to have with his own children.
Mm-hmm.
And I agree. One thing I think my parents did well is that my father often sat us down and explained to us why he was going to do something and how he had come to that conclusion. And as we got older, he would ask for our advice. I think that's very godly. That's what God does with Abraham. And what the text indicates, God expects Abraham to do with his own children. So we might ask ourselves, as our children age, have we ever had this conversation, like where we've come and said, I'm going to do this? How do you respond?
Mm-hmm.
And allowed them to have an interactive conversation with us that affected the outcome? Have we ever done that? It seems to me that the text indicates that God is having that conversation with Abraham so he would know how to do it with his own children.
Yeah.
That's what you're pointing out, right?
Yeah. I think that's something that I've described to you that we're trying to do as a family, as our kids have reached that age of adulthood. It's the beginning of getting them to think beyond just the orders or the directive, but to be people who influence what the directive is going to be. So it's much more complicated. It's a much more matured relationship. I think we've seen in this whole passage a greater depth of conversation and discussion between God and Abraham that shows a depth, more of depth, of growing, So the question, I think, comes out. It says, the Lord said, "There's the outcry against Sodom and Gomorrah is so great, and their sin is so grievous." Where's the outcry coming from?
Yeah, what do you think? Now, again, this is probably said this way for our benefit so that we can understand, but we have some narratives in the First Testament that might indicate what is behind a comment like this. I'm thinking right now of the book of Job. Do you remember all the sons of God, likely the angels, and Satan, come before God to give him an account of what's going on in the earth? And God says, "Where have you been?" to Satan. And he says, traveling the earth. And God says, "In your travels, have you noticed my servant Job?" So there is a picture in the scriptures, and of course Jacob later in Genesis will see the angels ascending and descending on this ladder that gives them access to the heavens and to the earth, right? And so there is a sense in the First Testament's world that God is getting regular reports of what's going on in the earth. Now that can freak us out if we're heavy theologians, because we believe God is omniscient and he knows everything, and I'm not questioning that. But there is, the way the story is told in the First Testament, the angels, the sons of God, are making regular reports to the Lord. And my first blush is that that's most likely what's behind this. God is getting reports of the earth, and he is being informed of one particularly wicked city. So God decides to send out a group to go and investigate these hearings. Now, does God have to do this? No. But he does do it. Remember, everything is a model for us. God behaves in a way that we are meant to learn from. Now, if you heard an accusation against somebody, what should you do? You should investigate. And how many witnesses will it take, according to the law of Moses eventually, to confirm a claim against somebody? It's going to take 2 or 3 witnesses. Yeah. How many angels are sent? 3. Yeah. Right? So, and 2 of them go to Sodom. So God is modeling for us the right way to govern. And it's important for that to Abraham to see that. So we're not saying God had to do it this way, but we do have to ask the question, why does he do it this way? And I think it's pretty clear that this is meant to be a model. When you hear an accusation, do you just believe it? When you find something on Facebook and somebody says somebody said something and you see the meme, do you just believe it and forward it? Or do you do some research? Do you require 2 or 3 witnesses? Do you go to see if the accusation is founded? Well, God does, so why don't you?
Right.
I think that's what comes out of the story.
Yeah. I mean, and it's obviously true that he wants to include Abraham, because if it were just God, God would know already. If you go, it's like, God can use the instant Google and find.
Yeah, we know God's omniscient, that there's no place anybody can hide from him, but that doesn't mean God doesn't follow procedures.
Right.
You can follow procedures you don't need. People can do that all the time. I follow procedures every day that I don't need.
Yeah. But I think it shows that he wants to include us.
Right. And that he's trying to disciple us.
Mm-hmm.
You can't disciple someone on how to be a god if they're not a god, but you can disciple someone on how to be a good human by showing them good examples of leadership that's within their grasp. You and I are not omniscient. So if God just always just knows everything, he can't help us.
Right.
So God humbles himself. And he does it in Jesus in the ultimate way. He humbles himself. But he humbles himself by going through processes that maybe he wouldn't have to go through, but he goes through them for our benefit so that we can learn the right way to do things. It seems to me that's clearly in play here, because he indicates he's only having this conversation with Abraham so Abraham can learn how to educate and bring up his children right.
Yeah. But it's not necessarily an example or model to try to negotiate with God, though. Would you agree?
I think it is a model. You don't think so?
Well,
Oh, good. We disagree.
Well, I don't know, because it's like, it doesn't seem like it's effective. It sounds like he's asking God if he'd be merciful, but in some ways it's like, if he knows it's that bad and he thinks there's only one or 2 people, and I mean, why did he stop at 10? I mean,
yeah,
wouldn't you naturally say? You might naturally, you'd say, people start out 100, or that, and say, well, what if it was just 1? Would Jesus just die for just one of us?
Yeah. Why doesn't Abraham go lower than 10? And that is a really good question, and it has historical significance. So we'll get into some of that, I think. But if he kept going to 1, would he prove himself just at all? Would you actually ask, like, if you have a city that is so wicked that it is doing things that are actually getting angels to report on it. I mean, it's so bad that Satan comes before the throne in Job, and he has bad things to share about Job. And you might expect Satan is going to share all the dirt from the beginning. But all the angels too? Like, that's the implication. I'm hearing this from everybody. Like, there's nobody who comes down here. If you ask God to spare that for 1 person, are you just at all? Like, everybody has their toleration of how many people. Abraham believes 10 should be sufficient. The question is, will God agree?
Yeah.
Now, Abraham apparently did not think 9 would be just. We all have our limits, right?
Yeah. Well, I think he's also, what you said too, is the converse is that whether God would be just at all if he let everybody go just because of 1 or 10. Or
well, we already know he's not going to spare the city for 1. It's not even worth asking.
Right.
How do we know that?
Well, he's going to wipe them all out.
Well, what about the story of Noah? How many righteous people were there in the story of Noah? There was Noah, his wife, his 3 sons, and their 3 wives. That's 8 people, and he did not spare the city. So probably Abraham knew. I'm not going to get him down to 8. He wiped out the whole earth. There were 8 righteous people, but maybe I can get him close to 8.
Well, maybe the question is wrong. Maybe it shouldn't be, are you going to wipe out the whole city, or should you? So the question really be, are you going to wipe out the righteous with the unrighteous? So in other words, if he does obviously spare Lot and tell him to run.
He does spare Lot and his daughters, and it's offered to their husbands too.
So you wonder if Abram's asking the wrong question. Should
Yeah,
we
I
spare
don't
the
know.
people or the city?
Yeah, I guess in hindsight, you might ask what would be a better conversation? Is there a better conversation? I think Abraham asks, well, let's think about it. Like for me, God says, I'm going to destroy this city. It's terrible. So that's the given.
Mhm.
The city's going down. So Abraham knows Lot lives in that city. And so he knows the implications of what God is saying.
Mhm.
He knows that Lot is at risk. Abraham wonders, how can I save Lot, maybe? But he also might wonder, how does God make these calculations? How wicked does a city have to be? And so he says, what if there are 50 righteous people in the city? Would you still destroy it? That's as much a question about who God is
Mhm.
as it might be an agenda to see if there's any chance for Lot.
Mhm.
And so I think Abraham is he's knocking at the door to see what happens. I don't think he's thinking, he didn't have any time to think about this. It's not like he has a plan. I think he's just responding like, okay, I got to feel this out. And when God says to him, if there are 50 righteous, I'll save it. Now he's learned something about God, and he has a little more hope for Lot. But Abraham's dealt with Sodom, and he's probably not sure there are 50 righteous people there. So let's see, where does God's mercy end? And so he keeps questioning to find out, because he calls him the judge of all the earth, to find out where the judge of all the earth draws the line. Now, I'm assuming Abraham has the story of Noah, at least because we are reading Genesis. That story is in our repertoire. And at that point, there were 8 people, and God did not spare the earth for 8. So I'm guessing Abraham is not going to see if he'll spare Sodom and Gomorrah for the same number of people he did not spare the earth for. So I think Abraham has 8. He's not going to get God below 8. But how many would it take to spare this city? And he gets as close to 8 as he possibly can. He stops with 10. And he knows 10 is not going to guarantee Lot's survival, because Lot is just Lot and his wife and 2 daughters. And if the 2 daughters are married, that's 6 people. Kids are not going to count. They'd have to be adult age in this culture. So he knows that there's not enough just in Lot's family to save that whole city, but he's wondering how many additional righteous people it would require. And it only requires 4 based on God's word. I think all of that is in play. I mean, how do you respond to that? I think Abraham's trying to figure out who God is. I think he's trying to figure out how desperate the situation is for Lot. I think he's trying to figure out where mercy and justice merge. And I still think he's got the story of the flood, so he knows where he has to stop. I don't know. Maybe I'm reading too much in, but
Yeah, screen locked up a second there, so didn't get all of that. But it seems that Abram is trying to understand, I think, God's mercy, and the idea of righteous and unrighteous, and how to judge them, and how to deal with them. Obviously, the righteous ones, God doesn't have a problem with. It's the people that they're with. So it almost seems like the request of Abram about destroying the city seems like kind of a red herring in some ways, but yet it does reveal the character of God. His mercy, his desire for people to turn. I mean, later on, if we look, we remember the passage where the promise was to Abram. There's going to be this 400 years or 450 years of captivity, and then because the sins of the Amorites have not come to completion,
Yeah.
there's a sense of mercy there as well, that people would turn. And even Sodom and Gomorrah and its wickedness, there is a desire. I still feel I don't want to give up on God's mercy for the wicked as well. But on the same token, we know that there will be judgment if they
Right.
turn.
Well, you seem a little negative on Abraham's tact. What would, if you could choose anything for him, what conversation would you prefer he would have? Do you think it would have been better for him just say, okay, if that's your decision? Do you think there was another tact he should have taken, or a different avenue of conversation? I mean, what would you see as a better way of not trying to get God to show mercy based on the number of righteous people?
Yeah, I guess I would wonder if he would just say, "Is there anyone righteous?" Or sort of like the Job conversation. I mean, is there anyone? Because maybe Abraham's afraid that Lot's not necessarily considered as righteous as Peter wants to make him out to be in 2 Peter.
Yeah.
Where Lot was a
I
righteous
would say
kid.
if Abraham was concerned about that, he would have asked the question you're suggesting.
Yeah.
But that's not the question he asked.
Right. Yeah. It's an interesting tact that he uses. I guess my fear is that people will use it as a principle for prayer. That feels more like a bargaining manipulation type of thing.
Yeah. It depends on what you're doing. Like, I can see that fear. We can't negotiate with God about the things he's told us are right or wrong. Like, nobody's going to talk to him about the 10 Commandments and whether or not they really have to be followed. Like, that's not allowed by the law. But this is a different circumstance. If God tells you to do something, when is it appropriate to push back and question it? And when do you just have to obey? You'll see that in the Abraham story. He negotiates with God here, but he does not in the sacrifice of his son in chapter 22. He does not negotiate with God in chapter 15 when he tells him that his descendants are going to be slaves in Egypt. So Abraham sometimes negotiates, sometimes doesn't. The question is, how did he know when he could and when he couldn't? I think this is a model for prayer, but we have to know when God is inviting us to negotiate and when he's not. Moses seemed to have this instinct too. You remember, like, God tells him you're going to go to Pharaoh, and Moses says, I can't go. That's a negotiation. Of course, that doesn't go well for Moses. But at another point, God says, you know what? The Israelites are already breaking the 10 Commandments, and we haven't even left Sinai. I'm going to wipe them out. And Moses negotiates with God then. He begs him not to do it. And God relents and listens to Moses. What's the difference? How is one effective and one not? How could Moses have known that in one instance his resistance would have been sinful, but in the other instance it saves a people? How do you know the difference? And so I'm very hesitant to say you can't negotiate with God, but I will say you have to know when. Yeah. And that's a deeper conversation. When is the right time?
Yeah, I think in some ways other than Lot, I don't see that there's any reason for Abraham to say anything about Sodom and Gomorrah other than the judgment of God's character. I think this reveals.
You don't think Abraham cared about those cities?
Well, I think he probably agreed with the outcry. I think that he was probably compassionate or caring about people in general. I mean, I want to think that.
But do you think you can agree that people are wicked and still not want to see them destroyed?
I think it depends on how distant you are from them. I think if you're in Nazi Germany and you saw some of the atrocities that happened there, the distance is much easier for us to not want judgment to come down. I mean, even
well, think about like the United States. You and I are living in the United States at a time where the country is clearly very wicked. They've turned away from God as a culture. Our laws are moving away from God's recommendations. We are calling things that the Christians have long understood to be sins. We're calling them not sins. And there's all kinds of stuff going on in our culture that by any measurement of scriptural truth, we would say our culture deserves to be judged. And yet, if God does judge this culture, we all live here. we're going to pay the price for the destruction along with the wicked. So there's plenty of reason to think that if you're really bound up in an economy, that you may know judgment should come, but you may still not want it to come.
Yeah.
And I think we don't know. Abraham is very bound up in the politics of this region. We already saw that when Sodom and Gomorrah were conquered and taken into captivity, Abraham gathered a whole lot of men to go free them and get things back to normal. There may have been a cost to Abraham personally for the destruction of this plain. Who knows how he was benefiting? Maybe they were buying his animals. Maybe they were purchasing from him, and this was one of his biggest clients. Like, you just don't know. So I can imagine lots of reasons why you would want to see a people spared, even if you know that they deserve to be judged. I'm facing that right now in the United States. Yeah. Even in the church, I know that we've done a lot of evil, and I know we deserve to be judged. But if the church is judged, there's a penalty to that I would rather avoid.
Yeah.
You know? So you never know. You and I think are not disagreeing so much as we're just talking at it from different angles. But I can imagine Abraham earnestly wanting to see these cities spared, even if he agreed they were wicked. Mm-hmm. And I tend to take this as a real intervention on their behalf. But maybe not. Maybe it was just an academic exercise.
I think at a surface level, people could probably say it was a testing of God to see His mercy. But I think there's something to what you're saying too about the economy, the idea of being a father of nations. Are all things, or to be like a mediator for those nations. Maybe an example that's being said here. I mean, even at the most wicked. I mean, you think of God sending Jonah to Nineveh, or those kinds of things where they were really, really wicked. And let's not be mistaken. Sodom and Gomorrah, they were expert sinners. I mean, it says that but it really, I think I've become to think of them not so much in the acts of their sins, but their attitudes toward God. Yeah, is what I think was emphasized at one point.
Yeah. In our conversation next week, we'll get into the particular sins of Sodom and Gomorrah once the angels go there in chapter 19. Yeah. But there's plenty wrong with that culture. And by the time everybody can see how corrupt a culture is, it's gone a long way, because most of the time corruption is kept pretty under wraps for a good long time. So the fact that their evil is spilling out and everybody sees it, that they're a long way down. You know?
There's definitely mercy at stake here that reveals the character of God, but also reveals the character of Abram. Yeah. To reflect the character of God, where the outcry is so strong.
Yeah. You would never see Jonah praying this for Nineveh.
No.
Is Jonah a better example than Abraham? Probably not.
Yeah. Well, he doesn't seem to have any desire for change.
He doesn't want to see Nineveh forgiven at all. Jonah doesn't, but Abraham does seem to want to see the people of Sodom given leniency. I can't understand this conversation in any other way. Yeah. So God's mercy way outstrips his justice, at least temporarily. And of course, I'm reading Job right now in my own Bible reading, and Job is frustrated that it really doesn't look like following God has tangible benefits in this life, because he sees so many wicked people who die completely at ease and happy. So where's justice? That's where I am in the book right now. Those are the accusations Job is making. Yeah. And his friends are really upset that he's making those. They think he's accusing God of being unjust. And so they're criticizing Job for making those comments. But Job is just saying, prove me wrong. How many wicked people do you know that died perfectly at ease? Tell me, where's justice? Well, of course, the answer to that is way in the future, when we find out that everyone's going to have to answer before the throne of God. But if there is no resurrection of the dead and there is no final judgment, there also is no justice. And it's because of God's mercy that it looks that way. That's the story of Abraham. And Abraham is wondering, Abraham wants mercy. And he clearly wants it. And he gets him down to 10.
Yeah. Well, if he didn't, he obviously would have said, just.
But I have a final comment or question for us to consider. And it has to do with these three angels. So one of the angels seems to be the angel of the Lord, because he's the one who remains with Abraham. And whenever he's talking, it says the Lord is talking. Mm-hmm. Is it interesting to you, though, that three of them come to Abraham, but only two go to Sodom and Gomorrah? Like this third angel, who clearly is angel of the Lord, because he's speaking for God directly, he doesn't go to Sodom and Gomorrah. Mm-hmm. I'm not sure what to make of that, but it seems a detail we should not neglect.
Yeah. I don't think much of it other than this is the way to capture and highlight this conversation. Maybe he's the actual. I don't know how to say it other than to think that he's the actual angel of death.
Yeah. Yeah, I wonder, and I'm just kind of thinking off the top of my head, if it adds to a sense of urgency. Because God wants to have this conversation with Abraham, he wants to delay, but he can't delay the trip to Sodom, so the other two have to go on without him. To me, the only way I can read it is that it adds a sense of the urgency of how immediate the need is to go and evaluate the situation in Sodom, that the two angels can't hang back and wait. They have to go. That's the only sense I can make of it.
Well, I think it's definitely important to have this conversation with Abraham, because it really shows that the connection that God wants to have with the essentialness of Abraham's calling of being the father of nations. In other words, it really shows. If you really think it from a parental point of view, if Sodom were your kid, would you be thinking that way too?
Yeah.
Be saying, let's have a little mercy on them. Let's set up some type of plan. Let's see if we can do something different. There would be some type of negotiation. That's what they do. But if you look at it from a parental point of view, I think God's enabling or trying to train him how to be a father.
I agree. And Abraham does reveal something about himself that I find quite remarkable, that he's willing to get into this very sensitive conversation where he doesn't know how God's going to react, which is clear by his, please don't let me offend you, if I ask another question. And he does this for Sodom, who he knows are wicked. And we're not speculating about that. He refused to take money from Sodom. So he seems to know it's dirty money there.
Yeah, I think that's the known in the equation. It's God's response that he's really looking for the.
But he intercedes for Sodom with the possibility that he would save that city by his prayer, and he engages in it for them. That's a very unlikely. Well, maybe it's not unlikely. It just feels unlikely to me that somebody's going to put their neck out for a city that seems known for such wickedness.
Well, he did it for Lot.
Maybe it was just for Lot, but
earlier he did it for Lot.
Yeah.
And so maybe that's the example of redemption.
Yeah, it at least Abraham hasn't glowed much in this story. He's had a few high points. Genesis 15 was a high point. His obedience in 17 is a high point, but he's had a lot of low points too. This is a place, though, where Abraham really shines for me. I guess that's why I'm reading him very generously, as being very sincere in his prayer for Sodom, because I see it as a very honorable and unexpected prayer. If he was going to pray for, maybe the people around the area of Hebron with whom he was living directly, or maybe people who weren't known to be great sinners, but who were, maybe they had their moral compromises. You could see him praying for people like that. But to pray for Sodom, it really tells me something about Abraham.
Mhm.
I don't know if I could pray for Sodom.
Yeah, well, even to this day, people compare Sodom and Gomorrah with other evils of the world throughout history.
I know, which is weird, right? Because Jesus says that Capernaum is actually more wicked.
Mhm.
Remember, he says, if the miracles done in you were done in Sodom and Gomorrah, they would have repented in sackcloth and ashes.
Mhm.
So Jesus says it'll be better for Sodom and Gomorrah on the day of judgment than for Capernaum. But Capernaum doesn't have that reputation. Yeah, the people of Sodom. But of course, as we get into the story next week, they do greet these angels horrifically.
But the people of Capernaum, they must have really enjoyed that comment.
Oh yeah, I know. Jesus, again, sometimes you can't be both kind and truthful.
The old punch in the nose.
Jesus seemed to know what time was right. You and I are often foolish in our decision making in that respect. But
Well, he had the MC Hammer song in his pocket. That's why I can't touch it.
yeah, maybe he was fearless. I don't know. They did a lot to him though.
Yes, they did.
So I see you avoided the question of these three angels. So maybe you don't want to take a stand on it. But my best stab is that it creates a sense of urgency, that all three came with the intent of going to Sodom and Gomorrah, but one of them hung behind because this conversation with Abraham was seen as critical. And so the other two could not delay. They had to go. And there is a sense that God had already determined to judge the city unless the angels found a reason for him not to. And so they've got to get there before God destroys it. And that's the way I read it. So they can't delay. And I think that's the reason the three split. But two have to go because as we find out in the law of Moses, God really wants 2 or 3 witnesses. So he sent 3, but one gets delayed talking to Abraham. The other 2 go on their own. And my sense is that the judgment has already been decreed and that whatever mechanism of judgment is going to arrive is already on the way. And so God could decide to relent based on what they discover, but they have to get there. That's my sense of it. And I know that feels weird because you're like, well, can't God do it? Of course, God can do whatever he wants. I'm not interested in talking about his capabilities, but simply talking about the way that he's doing it. And that's what I see.
Yeah. Also, I mean, if you follow that argumentation, you could say that the idea is more practically for us. It's good for us to investigate things rather than just judging the judgment.
Yeah.
So I mean, as a model, that might be something.
Yeah,
but
and it's not the only time it happens either.
Right.
Like with Moses, God sends the angel to kill Moses, and the angel is on his way to kill Moses. When Moses' wife intercepts the angel and does what Moses had failed to do, circumcises his son, and throws the foreskin at the feet of the angel, then the angel relents and doesn't kill Moses. But you'll notice the angel was already on the way. You get the same sense with Sodom and Gomorrah. God has already sent the judgment towards them, but the angels have an opportunity to perhaps stop the inevitable based on what they find. Yeah. And you get the same sense that Abraham might stop the inevitable based on this prayer. God, not because God is not sovereign, but it seems to me like what C.S. Lewis says, that God seems to give people the opportunity to affect real change in the world. Now, he chooses when to do that.
Right.
But it seems to me he's choosing to allow Abraham's input and to allow the angelic input before the final die is cast. But there seems to be an urgency in the text. That's my point.
Yeah, but I think intentionally that's why there's 3. And that for the instructive aspect of it for Abram.
Right.
Abraham is why the third one stays behind. I don't think you needed 3 witnesses.
Yeah, no, you only needed 2.
Yeah. I mean, to actually go to Sodom and Gomorrah and see their wickedness. I don't think they needed 3 guys to do that. No,
well, my point is that later principles that come out in the law of Moses and then even in the New Testament is that you're not allowed to execute judgment without 2 or 3 witnesses.
Yeah.
I don't think it would have taken 3 people to see the wickedness, but you still have to have 3 to agree before condemnation can be sent.
I mean, they could have invited him to go with, but I think as the way they say it in Pennsylvania, you want to go with, you know. I think it was more of the third was the teaching point, because they asked the question: should we talk to Abram about this? Should we ask his opinion? So it shows that God wants to interact with the righteous, with Abram.
Yeah, and it's important for Abram to have this conversation because it instructs his children. That's why I think it's got to be a model. And I do think we can negotiate with God if he invites the negotiation.
Yeah.
But there can also be a type of presumptuous negotiation where we negotiate like Moses tries to get out of going to Egypt. And that's presumptuous.
Yeah.
But in other cases, God invites the negotiation. And I think the more we walk with the Lord, the more we'll get a sense of the kinds of things he's willing to let us have input on and the kinds of things he's not.
Yeah, I think I've from the Hearing God book is a little bit of that element as well. Where people are looking for God's will, in which God, and I heard, correct me if I'm wrong from what you recall, but it makes the comment, the book Willard makes the comment that God wants us to help form that will to some degree. Do you buy into that concept? Or
I buy into it.
Something I was thinking about.
I don't buy into it as a general principle of creation that God, for instance, you could say God won't do anything without human consent. I've heard theologians say that.
Yeah,
it's a type of process theology or open theism that God does not want to force anybody to do anything, that he needs their consent, and so he will discuss and try and pressure sometimes, but he will never overwhelm. I don't believe that. I believe God does what he wants to do. I believe I've seen it happen in the scriptures where he takes control and forces someone to do what they don't want to do because it's what he wants done. So I'm not afraid of God doing that. But I do think that there are many occasions where he invites our participation and invites us to shape the outcomes. Mm-hmm. I see him doing that. And so I would say if God wills it, it would be wicked not to participate.
Right.
So yeah, to me, God is sovereign, but he rules in a way very different than human leaders do. Most human leaders do not want the input from people they consider less than them. Mm-hmm. Like they might take input from their peers. They might take input from experts that they think are greater than them, but very few are going to take input from people they think are less qualified than they are in any matter. But God is different because, of course, he has no peers. So there's no peer he could reach out to. And there is no expert who knows more than him. So most humans, when they think of the sovereignty of God, they think God's not going to ask for anybody's input. He doesn't need it. But they're thinking very human. God has a way of inviting input from people who are far inferior to him.
Yeah, that's examples here, though. It says, should we ask him? Should we talk to him about this?
You might say, if you were thinking as a human leader, you'd say, why? Why would you bother? Mm-hmm. And God's like, I'm going to put Abraham in charge of stuff. I need him to learn and to grow. And that's a great answer. Like, of course you ask for input. Why as a parent would you ask for input from your children? Why? Because they're smarter than you? Because they have more experience? Because they know better what should be done? No, because you want them to grow up. And if you don't give them any say, they'll never mature.
Yeah, it's definitely a teachable moment.
Yeah, and that's what God's doing with Abraham. Mm-hmm. And I think he does it with us too. So in that way, I would agree with Willard.
Yeah, holistically, I wouldn't say that. I think that's the qualifier. But I thought it was interesting to hear him say that, because so many people think that the will of God is as concrete as written down piece of paper map kind of thing, and really begin to miss the point that there's a dynamic growth and development of faith and faith walk. I think we see that here in this passage, where God is.
God's will is sometimes concrete and cannot be moved. And you're foolish to kick against those goads.
Mm-hmm.
But other times his will is more fluid, and he's willing to give us the opportunity to have input before it's finalized. And I think that's all in his sovereignty. He's the one who chooses where he'll allow us to have input and where he won't. But I do think you can't have a good relationship with God unless you recognize that there are plenty of times where he allows you to have input. There are even times in the Psalms where he seems to pull away almost entirely from our conscious awareness and forces us to make decisions without him. And that's not because he's gone, but that's how you mature a creature.
It also reflects the character. It shows what's coming out. So like the process of getting the impurities out. You're going to see what's going to pop out when the stress.
Yeah. And that is evidenced here, that God has a future for Abraham that requires him to have this kind of responsibility. Yeah, and so God gives us responsibilities, not just always to obey, but sometimes even to creatively think and to strategize and to inquire. Like, that's all part of our relationship with God. I think the trick is knowing when is the right time and when isn't. And Moses did not know that early on, and neither did Abraham, but they learn. Abraham comes across this very carefully. Like, you can see behind all of his, Lord, don't let me offend you. If I'm going too far, you tell me. But if you'll entertain a question, I would like to ask. That's very humble, because God could have said, I'm not changing my mind about this, Abram, so don't even try. And I think Abram would have gone, okay, good enough.
Yeah. Well, even Jesus experienced that with John and James, son of thunder. Should we cut on lightning on them? You know,
yeah, should we destroy them?
It didn't seem like they maybe learned a lesson from Abraham.
Yeah. Well, because that does happen. Like Elijah and the fire on Mount Carmel and other things. I mean, they certainly have biblical precedent for asking the question, but they find out pretty quickly that that's not what Jesus is looking for.
Right.
So I think we pretty well covered this text, and I know there's more to talk about, but it's such a rich text, and the life of Abraham is becoming so interesting and so applicable. And I see people praying like Abraham a lot, especially praying for lost loved ones or children who have turned away from the faith. Like Abraham, they come before the Lord and say, Lord, what can I say to you? What can be done for my child? What can be done for my husband or my wife? What can be done for my parent? What can be done for my cousin? And I think that's a godly impulse to ask. But we always have to remember, sometimes God decrees that judgment will come and there's nothing we can do. But the people of God, I think, are always looking to mediate for the lost. I think it's what it means for us to be a priesthood of believers. And I am suspicious of the James and John people whose first instinct is to want to watch the world burn. There's something very godly about Abraham, where he comes before the Lord on behalf of very accomplished sinners and interrogates how merciful God is willing to be. That's a model many Christians could use to learn from, myself included.
Yeah, I agree. Not just you, but me too. Yeah, it's easier to want to judge the person first and ask the questions later.
And we know that the people of Sodom are great sinners. It's been said twice now.
Right.
In the text.
And I usually ask people when they say, are homosexuals going to hell, or other people going to hell, or people in content pornography going to hell? And I usually say, ask them the story. Walk with them a little bit to try to understand them before you just judge them. Try to. And I think that's what Abraham does here.
And what the angels honestly were doing, they were investigating Sodom personally.
Right. Walk with them a little bit.
Yeah. And before God takes his, this is a connection with the book of Ezekiel. Before God takes his glory from the temple in Jerusalem, Ezekiel sees the vision of that. It's a terrible vision. He watches the glory leave the Holy of Holies and go to one of the gates and then leave Jerusalem. Must have been terrifying for him to see that. But before God does that, he leads Ezekiel on a tour of the city where Ezekiel sees all the things that have been done in secret. And by the time he finishes that tour, Ezekiel wants the glory of God to leave. Because once he sees it, God investigates. And you and I don't get to decide if someone living in what we would call outright sin, we don't get to decide their final destiny. That is a decision God will make.
Right.
And God will make it fully informed. He's not just going to hear rumors about Sodom and Gomorrah. He's going to investigate it personally.
Mhm.
And if God does condemn a person, it will not be because he overlooked something. And you and I have to be careful that we don't put ourselves in the place of God and say that we know for sure how God will judge an individual. But we are responsible to say what God's ethics are.
Mhm.
And that does not, knowing what's right and wrong biblically, does not automatically translate into knowing how God will adjudicate a particular situation. But we still have to declare what right and wrong is, and then leave the final judgment to the Lord, knowing that he's a God who sent angels to investigate Sodom and Gomorrah before he destroyed it, who investigated every nook and cranny of Jerusalem before he decided to remove his presence, and will not condemn anybody without a thorough inquiry. But you and I, we're not responsible to make that final judgment. We can tell people, based on your life, it doesn't look to me like you're walking as God would want you to walk. But that's a far cry from saying how God will judge it. And there may be people who are living in ways that are clearly sin, but God knows mitigating circumstances that you and I cannot possibly evaluate. I've often said, you and I can see where someone is, but that's not always a good gauge of how far they've come. You're born in a Christian family, raised with Christian values, moderately affluent, a good education. You're going to look a lot more pristine quicker than someone who was born in a horrible situation with lots of abuse and bad role modeling and all kinds of stuff that they're carrying with them. Sometimes you evaluate two people where they are, and one person looks much holier than the other. But the truth is, this person has moved about 6 inches from where they were born, and the other person is miles from where they were born. Only God can do that math. So we have to be very careful about thinking we can size a person up simply by looking at where they stand right now.
Right.
But that's not an excuse to sin.
Mhm.
God is the one who evaluates all this, and no one should feel very secure
Mhm.
living wickedly. No one should feel secure in that. But what's evidenced here is that God is really merciful. Can you imagine sparing this whole city for 10 righteous people? So we know that if there is a way to be merciful, he will be.
Right.
But we also know that judgment comes.
Yeah.
So there will be those who are condemned, and Jesus indicates that it's the majority. At least that's how I read his parables. Wide is the road that leads to destruction, and many find it. Narrow is the road that leads to life, and few find it. It seems to me that the majority will be condemned, but you and I cannot pick out who those people are based solely on a cursory evaluation of how they present themselves to us.
Mhm.
Yeah, I think that's a good warning. Well, thank you, Minister Joe. You have final words for our folks?
Well, know that God's mercy and love is great. His judgment will come. But most importantly, he has made us with the capacity to relate to him. And I think it's modeled in his passage as well. And that, not that it'll be exactly the same. I'm not promoting that or some kind of format that you can negotiate with God, but I'm saying that it's important that to realize that he values our input, that he loves us, and that he is encouraging us. to make those connections, to listen to his voice, to realize that we're more than just pawns, should we say.
Yeah. Yep. Agreed.